The camera runs out of battery in darkness, and that's when you hear it. The wet slap of bare feet on blood-slick tile, the rattling of chains, the whisper of a voice promising marriage or mutilation or salvation. You're holding a camera like it's a weapon, but it's not. It's a lens, and what it shows you in that sickly green night vision is worse than any monster movie prepared you for. These aren't creatures, they're patients. They were people before Murkoff Corporation turned Mount Massive Asylum into a laboratory for weaponized madness, before the morphogenic engine rewired their traumas into something that hunts. Outlast doesn't hide its monsters in fog or summon them from guilt. It locks them in an asylum, experiments on their broken minds until the cracks become chasms, then opens the doors and watches what happens when psychiatric patients become living weapons. This is horror built not from supernatural punishment, but from institutional cruelty, from taking people already damaged by abuse, war, and trauma, then deliberately making them worse. The Murkoff Corporation didn't create mental illness. They found it, isolated it, amplified it, and turned human suffering into a research project with a body count. Tonight we're diagnosing every character in Outlast, examining the authentic psychiatric conditions that make Mount Massive Asylum more terrifying than any haunted house. We're talking major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, psychotic breaks, dissociative states, personality disorders with sadistic features, and trauma responses so severe they require their own diagnostic categories. But here's what separates Outlast from typical asylum horror. These characters aren't scary because they're mentally ill. They're scary because someone took their mental illness and weaponized it. They're victims who became perpetrators not through choice but through systematic psychological torture disguised as treatment. The morphogenic engine sits at the center of Mount Massive's horrors, a machine that forces patients to view hypnotic imagery while in lucid dream states, inducing production of nanomachines that eventually form the Wall Rider entity. But the engine doesn't just create nanotech, it creates madness, deliberately, methodically. The patients strapped into that device experience psychological torture designed to break whatever fragile coping mechanisms kept them functional. Take someone with PTSD from military service, show them engineered nightmares of their worst memories. Do this repeatedly until their grip on reality shatters. That's not treatment. That's weaponized psychiatry, turning therapeutic techniques into instruments of destruction. Understanding Outlast requires understanding how mental illness becomes exploitable. Psychiatric patients in the real world face stigma, inadequate care, and systemic neglect. They're vulnerable populations that society often forgets. Murkoff Corporation recognized this vulnerability and built a business model around it. Find people whose minds are already fractured by trauma. Offer them treatment in a remote facility where no one will check on them, then experiment freely. The variants we encounter aren't monsters created from nothing. They're psychiatric patients whose pre-existing conditions were deliberately exacerbated until they became dangerous. Their violence isn't inherent to their mental illness. It's the result of torture masquerading as therapy. This creates a different horror than Silent Hill's psychological amplification. Silent Hill takes your guilt and makes it walk. Outlast takes vulnerable people and breaks them further for profit. The supernatural exists here. The Wall Rider is real. The nanomachines are real. But the true horror is human. Dr. Wernicke's Nazi experimentation continued by corporate funding. Psychiatrists using therapeutic techniques to induce psychosis rather than treat it. A facility that presents as charitable research while conducting experiments that violate every ethical boundary medicine has established. Mount Massive Asylum is what happens when capitalism meets psychiatry, with all oversight removed. The characters we'll examine represent a spectrum of mental health conditions, but they share a common thread: exploitation. Every variant was admitted to Mount Massive with existing psychiatric issues, and every one was made worse by what happened there. We'll diagnose them based on their behaviors, their documented histories, and the clinical presentations the game shows us. But we'll also acknowledge that their conditions at the time Miles Upshur arrives are not their baseline. These are people post-torture, post-experimentation, post-abandonment by the staff who fled the asylum during the outbreak. We're seeing the absolute worst versions of their disorders, pushed to extremes by systematic abuse. Mental illness exists on a spectrum. Most people with PTSD don't become violent. Most people with psychotic disorders don't hunt humans through darkened corridors. Most people with personality disorders function in society without harming others, but introduce profound trauma, remove all treatment and support, add deliberate psychological torture, place them in an environment where survival instincts override everything else, and you get the variants. They're not representative of mental illness generally. They're examples of what happens when mental illness is deliberately cultivated and weaponized by people who view human suffering as data. The game forces players into the body of Miles Upshur, an investigative journalist with a camera and no combat ability, navigating spaces full of people whose psychiatric conditions make them dangerous. This powerlessness creates terror, but it also creates something else: recognition that these aren't evil beings. They're patients. Chris Walker is trying to complete his mission. Father Martin genuinely believes he's serving God. Eddie Gluskin is repeating the only relationship pattern he knows. They're not choosing monstrosity. They're trapped in it, as surely as Miles is trapped in the asylum. We begin our examination not with the protagonist, but with the prophet, the man who sees divinity in disaster, who believes the wall rider isn't a weapon, but a god worthy of worship. Let's talk about what happens when religious delusion meets institutional abandonment, when a patient with pre-existing psychotic features encounters something that validates every messianic belief he's ever had. Father Martin Archambaud, Messianic Delusion, and Self-Immolation. Father Martin appears calm in catastrophe, a bald man in his 60s wearing improvised priest's vestments, moving through the asylum's carnage with serene purpose. He calls Miles an apostle, speaks of gospel and resurrection, and treats the massacre unfolding around them as divine revelation rather than tragedy. Martin isn't a priest, he's a patient who adopted that identity, but his delusion is so complete, his conviction so absolute, that he's built a cult within the asylum's walls, convincing other variants to follow his interpretation of events. Martin exhibits delusional disorder with grandiose and religious features. His core delusion centers on the Wall Rider, the entity composed of nanomachines with Billy Hope as its host. Where others see a dangerous anomaly, Martin sees God. This isn't metaphorical. He genuinely believes the Wall Rider is a divine being, that its escape will bring salvation, that witnessing it requires spreading its gospel. The delusion is systematized, meaning Martin has constructed an entire theological framework around it. He has explanations for everything, interprets events through his delusional lens, and cannot be dissuaded by contrary evidence because the delusion has become his entire reality structure. The diagnostic criteria for delusional disorder require the presence of one or more delusions lasting at least 1 month, with the delusion not being attributable to substances or another mental disorder. Martin's belief system meets these criteria. He's not hallucinating. He can accurately perceive the physical environment around him. He's not disorganized. His speech is coherent. His plans are methodical, and he functions with considerable competence despite his delusion. The delusion itself is non-bizarre in the sense that it concerns something that could theoretically exist, a powerful entity worthy of worship, even though his specific interpretation is false. He identified Billy Hope's wall rider as that entity and built his entire psychological structure around serving it. Martin's religious framing isn't coincidental. Religious delusions are among the most common forms of grandiose delusions, particularly in individuals with pre-existing religious backgrounds or exposure. Martin likely had strong religious beliefs before admission to Mount Massive, possibly even genuine training or involvement with religious institutions. The delusion didn't create his religious thinking. It hijacked it, replacing whatever faith he previously held with worship of something he encountered at the asylum. This often occurs when someone with delusional disorder encounters a phenomenon their mind interprets as validation of grandiose beliefs. The wall rider's existence, its power, its seemingly supernatural abilities, all provided Martin's delusional mind with the proof it needed. What makes Martin particularly dangerous is his organizational ability, despite his delusion. He's convinced the twins to serve him, influenced other variants to grant Miles safe passage through certain areas, and even managed to manipulate the asylum systems to advance his goals. This indicates that his delusion is circumscribed. It affects his understanding of the wall rider specifically, but leaves other cognitive functions largely intact. He can plan, persuade, and execute complex schemes, all in service of his delusional conviction. Martin's treatment of Miles demonstrates how delusional disorder affects interpersonal relationships. He genuinely cares about Miles in his own way, wants to save him by showing him the truth about the wall rider, and believes that sedating him and preventing his escape is an act of mercy rather than cruelty. From Martin's perspective, letting Miles leave would damn him. He wouldn't have received the gospel, wouldn't understand the divine nature of what's happening. Martin sees himself as a spiritual guide, and his actions toward Miles, however harmful, come from genuine delusional conviction that he's helping. The morphogenic engine likely exacerbated Martin's pre-existing delusional tendencies. If Martin entered Mount Massive with mild religious delusions or grandiose thinking, exposure to the engine's nightmare imagery combined with awareness of the Wall Rider Project could have crystallized those diffuse beliefs into a fully formed delusional system. The engine doesn't create entirely new psychotic symptoms. It amplifies existing vulnerabilities, finds the cracks in someone's reality testing, and widens them into breaks. Martin's ultimate fate, crucifying himself and setting the cross on fire, believing he will be resurrected, demonstrates the absolute conviction of delusional disorder. Most people, even those with strong religious faith, would experience self-preservation instincts when facing immolation. Martin's delusion has overridden those instincts entirely. He doesn't just believe intellectually that he'll be resurrected. He experiences that belief as certain knowledge, as real as gravity or sunlight. The pain of burning alive cannot compete with the psychological reality of his delusion. This death also reveals the tragedy of untreated delusional disorder. Martin might have been treatable with antipsychotic medication and appropriate therapy. Instead, he was subjected to experimental procedures that made his condition worse, abandoned when the asylum fell apart, and left to die acting out his delusion with no intervention. His death isn't heroic martyrdom. It's a psychiatric patient experiencing a preventable tragedy because the institution that should have treated him instead exploited him. Martin exhibits no insight into his condition. Insight, in psychiatric terms, refers to awareness that one is experiencing mental illness. Martin has zero insight. He doesn't believe he's delusional because from his perspective he isn't. Everything he believes, he's witnessed. The wall rider exists, therefore his beliefs about it are validated, therefore he isn't ill. This lack of insight is characteristic of delusional disorders and makes them particularly resistant to treatment even when treatment is offered. The secondary diagnosis for Martin might include schizotypal personality traits, given his odd appearance, behavior, and social relationships. However, the game provides insufficient evidence of long-term personality patterns to confirm a personality disorder diagnosis. What's clear is that Martin has severe delusional disorder with religious themes, poor to absent insight, and organizational abilities that make him effective at spreading his delusion despite its falseness. Martin's cult following within the asylum demonstrates how delusions can become contagious in closed environments. Shared psychotic disorder, also called folie à deux, occurs when a delusion is transmitted from one person to others in close association. Some of the variants who follow Martin may have adopted his beliefs through this mechanism. His conviction was so powerful, his explanation so systematized, that individuals with their own cognitive vulnerabilities began sharing his delusional framework. The asylum's isolation, the visible presence of the wall rider, and the breakdown of normal reality checks all created conditions where Martin's delusion could spread like infection. Chris Walker, PTSD, psychotic features, and the soldier who never stopped fighting. The sound of chains rattling announces him before he appears, a massive man, well over 6 feet tall, impossibly strong, missing his nose and lips from self-mutilation. Chris Walker is Outlast's most persistent threat, a variant who hunts miles with single-minded determination, capable of ripping heads from bodies with his bare hands, collecting those heads as trophies in a grotesque display. But before Mount Massive destroyed him, Chris Walker was a military police officer who served multiple tours in Afghanistan, a man who wanted to serve his country and instead brought his war home with him in his mind. Walker's documented history reveals a textbook progression of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder that was mishandled at every stage. After his military service in Iraq, which included incidents that remain partially classified but clearly involved significant trauma, Walker was referred to a facility called Spindletop for PTSD treatment. Instead of receiving evidence-based trauma therapy, Walker appears to have been subjected to experimental treatments that made his symptoms worse. The phrase, "the failed therapy at Spindletop created a killer," appears in his documented history, suggesting that improper or harmful interventions took a soldier with PTSD and transformed his trauma responses into violence. PTSD from combat includes specific symptom clusters, re-experiencing symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares, avoidance of trauma reminders, negative changes in beliefs and feelings, and arousal symptoms including hypervigilance and exaggerated startle response. Walker would have experienced all of these after his Iraq deployment. The re-experiencing would make him relive whatever he witnessed or did during his service. The hypervigilance would make him constantly scan for threats, unable to relax even in safe environments. The negative cognitions might include beliefs like, "the world is completely dangerous," or "I can't trust anyone." Military police face particular psychological strain during combat deployments in conflicts like the Iraq War. Unlike frontline combat troops who have clear enemies and defined missions, military police often deal with ambiguous situations, dealing with detainees, investigating incidents involving fellow service members, maintaining order in chaotic environments. This moral ambiguity creates risk for moral injury, which differs from standard PTSD in that it involves damage to one's ethical framework from participating in or witnessing events that violate deeply held beliefs. If Walker was involved in incidents during his tours that required him to act against his values, moral injury could have compounded his PTSD. The self-mutilation, removing his own nose and lips, indicates severe anxiety escalated to psychotic levels. The documented explanation states this mutilation resulted from extreme anxiety, suggesting Walker experienced such profound distress that he engaged in catastrophic self-harm. This isn't typical self-injury for emotional regulation. This is someone who either experienced command hallucinations telling him to mutilate himself, or who developed such extreme somatic delusions that he felt compelled to destroy parts of his own face. Either explanation indicates a psychotic break, meaning Walker's PTSD had progressed to PTSD with psychotic features, a particularly severe variant where the trauma-related disorder produces symptoms like hallucinations or delusions. When Walker arrived at Mount Massive, he was subjected to the morphogenic engine. For someone with combat PTSD, the engine's trauma-inducing imagery would be catastrophic. Imagine someone already haunted by combat memories, already struggling to distinguish past trauma from present reality, being forced to experience engineered nightmares designed to maximize psychological damage. The engine would have taken Walker's existing trauma and amplified it exponentially, removed any remaining reality testing, and pushed him fully into psychosis. Walker's behavior at Mount Massive reveals the mission fixation common in military-trained individuals whose PTSD includes psychotic features. He believes he must maintain containment, that he's still operating under military authority, that killing is justified because he's completing a necessary mission. When he encounters Miles, he calls him Little Pig and pursues him with determination that suggests Miles represents something specific in Walker's delusional framework, perhaps an enemy combatant, perhaps a security breach, perhaps something that must be eliminated to maintain the mission. Crucially, Walker appears to understand that the Walrider represents a threat requiring containment. Documents reveal he was aware of the Walrider project and viewed it as dangerous. This awareness drove his killing spree. He's murdering patients and staff not randomly, but in service of what he perceives as a legitimate military objective. In Walker's mind, he's still a military police officer completing his assigned duties. The fact that the asylum has collapsed, that there's no chain of command, that his mission is actually psychotic delusion, doesn't register. His PTSD psychosis fusion has locked him into a combat mentality where everything is threat assessment and target elimination. Walker's treatment of Miles, throwing him through windows, pursuing him relentlessly, attempting to rip him apart, isn't personal. It's operational. Miles has become a hostile entity that must be neutralized. This depersonalization is common in combat trauma, where individuals learn to view others as targets rather than humans. The military trains this deliberately to make soldiers effective in combat, but when that training combines with psychotic symptoms, the result is someone who cannot distinguish between wartime enemies and civilian journalists, between combat zones and asylum corridors. The trophy heads Walker collects indicate a concerning progression beyond even psychotic PTSD. This behavior suggests either a developing paraphilia related to killing or simply mission documentation, keeping evidence of eliminated threats. Serial killers take trophies for psychological gratification. Soldiers sometimes collect evidence of confirmed kills. Walker's collecting might be either, but given his overall presentation suggests mission-focused killing rather than sadistic pleasure. The heads likely represent his way of tracking successful target eliminations. Walker's physical presentation, his massive size, his strength, his apparent imperviousness to pain, might be partially explained by a psychotic state creating diminished pain perception. Individuals experiencing psychotic episodes can sometimes perform feats of strength or endurance that seem superhuman because they're not responding to normal pain signals or fatigue. Walker's pursuit of miles appears tireless because his psychotic break has overridden normal physical limitations. The diagnostic picture for Walker is severe combat-related PTSD with psychotic features, possible psychotic disorder independent of the PTSD, likely traumatic brain injury given his military service and the physical damage visible on his face, and behavioral patterns consistent with mission fixation that has become delusional. He exhibits no insight into his condition, believing his actions are appropriate and necessary. His violence isn't impulsive rage, but calculated execution of what he perceives as legitimate operational objectives. Walker's fate, torn apart by the wall rider after repeatedly attempting to kill Miles, represents the ultimate failure of systems meant to help veterans. He was a soldier who served his country, developed severe PTSD from that service, was failed by military mental health systems, was exploited by corporate experimentation, and died executing a delusional mission that his broken mind told him was real. His story is a condemnation of how society treats veterans with invisible wounds, farming them out to facilities that experiment rather than heal, abandoning them when their symptoms become inconvenient. Eddie Gluskin, From Victim to Perpetrator. If you hear wedding music echoing through ventilation shafts, if you smell blood mixed with formaldehyde, if you see an operating table surrounded by mannequin parts and mutilated corpses, you've entered Eddie Gluskin's domain. The vocational block of Mount Massive becomes his workshop, his hunting ground, his grotesque theater, where he searches for the perfect bride among the male patients unfortunate enough to cross his path. Eddie calls himself the groom, moves with a disturbing gentility despite the horror he creates, and speaks of love and marriage while performing forced gender reassignment surgeries on his victims with no anesthetic, no medical knowledge, and no comprehension that what he's doing is torture rather than romance. Eddie Gluskin entered Mount Massive Asylum with a documented history of severe trauma, repeated sexual abuse by his father and uncle during childhood. This prolonged, inescapable abuse from family members created complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that develops from chronic trauma rather than single incidents. Complex PTSD includes all standard PTSD symptoms: intrusive memories, hypervigilance, negative emotional states, plus additional features like difficulty regulating emotions, negative self-concept, and profound difficulties in relationships. Sexual abuse during childhood has specific psychological consequences. It warps developing sexuality, creates associations between intimacy and violation, destroys the ability to trust, and often results in victims either becoming hypersexual or experiencing sexual aversion. In Eddie's case, the abuse appears to have created a pathological need to control intimate relationships combined with deep misogyny. His abusers were male family members who should have protected him, and somehow his mind processed this trauma into hatred of women and obsessive idealization of marriage. This progression from abuse victim to violent misogynist isn't universal. Most abuse survivors don't become perpetrators, but it occurs often enough that it's clinically documented. The psychological mechanism involves the victim internalizing their abuser's patterns, learning that relationships equal power and control, and developing distorted beliefs about gender, sexuality, and intimacy. Eddie didn't develop empathy from his suffering. He developed the conviction that inflicting suffering is how relationships function. Before Mount Massive, Eddie had developed what the documents describe as murderous, misogynistic tendencies. This phrasing suggests not just thoughts, but actual plans, or perhaps even actions toward women. He was admitted to the asylum ostensibly for treatment, but instead was sent to the underground lab where the morphogenic engine transformed his existing psychopathology into something far worse. The engine's effect on Eddie was particularly devastating. Someone with complex PTSD from sexual abuse, already struggling with distorted sexuality and relationship patterns, subjected to engineered nightmares and lucid dream manipulation, would experience catastrophic deterioration. The engine likely showed Eddie imagery related to his trauma, forced him to relive his abuse in dream states where he couldn't wake up, and amplified his existing rage and confusion into psychotic features. What emerged was Eddie Gluskin the Groom, a variant whose psychosis centers on a delusion about marriage. Eddie's delusion is specific and systemized. He must find the perfect woman to marry him and start a family. The fact that he's in an all-male asylum doesn't dissuade him. He'll simply create women through surgical modification of male victims. This delusion has overridden any connection to reality, any understanding that his victims are people suffering and dying, any awareness that he's torturing rather than romancing. In Eddie's psychotic state, he genuinely believes he's courting potential wives, and when they inevitably fail his impossible standards, he kills them for being whores or unfaithful. This pattern reveals Eddie's psychosis includes paranoid features. He's not just searching for a bride. He's convinced that women are inherently unfaithful, that he must test them, that they will inevitably betray him. This paranoid conviction drives his violence. He needs to punish their imagined betrayals. The paranoia likely stems from his abuse history, where trusted family members betrayed him in the most profound way possible, creating a core belief that all intimate relationships end in betrayal. Eddie's behavior toward Wayland Park demonstrates his complete psychotic break from reality. He captures Wayland, straps him to an operating table, calls him darling, and begins explaining his search for the perfect wife while preparing to perform surgery. Eddie speaks tenderly even while threatening torture, mixes declarations of love with graphic descriptions of mutilation, and appears genuinely confused when his victims don't reciprocate his affection. This disconnect between his tone and actions indicates that Eddie is experiencing a fundamentally different reality than observable events. The sexual sadism in Eddie's actions adds another diagnostic layer. While his motivation is ostensibly creating a bride, the methods involve genital mutilation, prolonged suffering, and a fascination with his victim's pain that suggests sadistic personality features. Sexual sadism disorder involves intense sexual arousal from physical or psychological suffering of others. Eddie may experience genuine arousal from the torture he inflicts, with the marriage delusion serving as justification rather than actual motivation. Alternatively, the apparent sadism might be a consequence of his psychosis rather than a primary feature. He's so disconnected from reality that he doesn't register his victim's suffering as real. Eddie's final scene, accidentally killing himself with a buzzsaw during his confrontation with Waylon, demonstrates the impulsivity and poor reality testing of severe psychosis. He's so fixated on capturing Waylon that he loses spatial awareness, doesn't register immediate danger, and dies from his own weapon. This tragic end reflects how psychotic individuals often lack awareness of risks that would be obvious to neurotypical people. Eddie was so consumed by his delusion that basic self-preservation failed. The diagnostic picture for Eddie is complex PTSD from childhood sexual abuse, psychotic disorder with delusions and paranoid features, likely schizophrenia given the severity and persistence of his symptoms, and possible sexual sadism disorder or sadistic personality traits. He demonstrates zero insight, believing his actions are appropriate courtship rather than murder. His misogyny isn't just bias but delusional thinking, where he's constructed an entire false belief system about gender and relationships that no evidence can penetrate. Eddie represents one of Outlast's clearest condemnations of the asylum system. He entered Mount Massive with treatable conditions. Complex PTSD responds to trauma-focused therapy. Even his developing violent thoughts could have been addressed with appropriate psychiatric intervention. Instead, Murkoff Corporation identified his vulnerabilities, subjected him to procedures that amplified his worst psychological features, and created a serial killer where treatment might have created a survivor. His story also complicates the victim-perpetrator binary. Eddie is genuinely a victim of childhood abuse, of institutional failure, of experimental torture, but he's also genuinely a perpetrator. He tortured and killed multiple people, caused immense suffering, and did so with enough awareness to plan and execute his attacks. Both realities exist simultaneously. His victimization doesn't erase his violence, and his violence doesn't erase his victimization. This uncomfortable truth is central to Outlast's horror. The variants are simultaneously dangerous and damaged, perpetrators who are also victims of systems that failed them. Richard Traeger, corporate psychopathy meets medical sadism. The pristine white walls of the administration block create false sterility, as though cleanliness could disguise the horror conducted within. Richard Traeger moves through these corridors with businessman efficiency, dressed in shirt and tie despite the bloodstains, carrying himself with the posture of someone accustomed to authority. He isn't scrambling through darkness like the other variants. He has power in the asylum, commands it through sheer force of personality, and when he captures Miles Upshur, he doesn't immediately kill. He toys, experiments, performs what he calls therapy with surgical instruments and recording equipment, documenting suffering with the detached interest of someone conducting product testing. Traeger represents a fundamentally different psychological profile than the other variants. While Chris Walker broke under combat trauma and Eddie Gluskin shattered from childhood abuse, Traeger's pathology likely predates Mount Massive entirely. Documents reveal he was a Murkoff Corporation executive working in business development before becoming a patient. Someone with significant authority whose pre-existing antisocial traits made him useful to a corporation willing to torture for profit. His position wasn't as a psychiatric patient initially, but as someone complicit in the asylum's operations, who eventually became subjected to the same systems he helped implement. Antisocial personality disorder, formerly called sociopathy or psychopathy, depending on severity and presentation, involves pervasive disregard for others' rights, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and often criminal behavior. Individuals with this disorder view other people as objects to be used rather than beings with inherent value. They can intellectually understand that others experience pain, but feel no emotional resonance with that suffering. This creates capacity for cruelty without remorse, exploitation without guilt, and violence without hesitation. Traeger exhibits nearly every diagnostic criterion for antisocial personality disorder. He demonstrates failure to conform to social norms. His therapy sessions are torture, but he presents them with professional veneer. He shows deceitfulness, repeatedly lying to Miles about his intentions while preparing to mutilate him. He displays impulsivity and irritability, shifting rapidly from false friendliness to explosive violence. Most significantly, he demonstrates complete lack of remorse. After removing Miles's fingers with bone shears, Traeger expresses no guilt, only annoyance that Miles isn't, grateful for the help. What elevates Traeger beyond standard antisocial personality disorder into potential psychopathy is his sadism. He doesn't just harm without empathy, he actively enjoys causing suffering. When he straps Miles to a wheelchair and begins his therapy, Traeger's voice carries genuine enthusiasm. He's not detached or clinical. He's engaged, excited, deriving pleasure from his victim's fear and pain. This combination of antisocial traits and sadistic pleasure indicates sadistic personality disorder, a controversial diagnosis removed from official diagnostic manuals, but still recognized by clinicians who treat individuals who derive gratification from cruelty. Traeger's corporate background is crucial to understanding his pathology. Corporate psychopaths are individuals with antisocial personality disorder who function successfully in business environments. They're drawn to positions of power where ruthlessness is rewarded, where lack of empathy creates advantage in competitive environments, where manipulation is reframed as leadership and exploitation is called business acumen. Companies like Murkoff Corporation, willing to torture psychiatric patients for profit, don't create corporate psychopaths, but they certainly attract them and promote them rapidly. The morphogenic engine's effect on Traeger differs from its effect on other variants. For traumatized individuals like Walker or Eddie, the engine amplified existing wounds. For Traeger, who likely lacked significant trauma and possessed substantial ego strength combined with antisocial traits, the engine might have simply removed inhibitions. Whatever minimal social constraints prevented Traeger from openly torturing people in corporate settings dissolved at Mount Massive, leaving him free to indulge sadistic impulses without consequence. Traeger's therapy sessions reveal his need for power and control. He positions himself as helper. "I'm here to help you, buddy," while actively harming Miles. This false benevolence is a manipulation technique common in individuals with antisocial personality disorder. They understand that presenting as helpful makes victims compliant, and compliance makes exploitation easier. Traeger isn't confused about what he's doing. He's deliberately creating psychological dissonance in his victim, making Miles question whether cooperation might somehow lead to survival. The finger amputation scene demonstrates Traeger's sadism with clinical clarity. He doesn't simply cut off Miles's fingers, he makes it theatrical, films it for posterity, talks Miles through the process like he's conducting educational demonstration. The filming is particularly diagnostic. Traeger isn't just satisfying personal sadistic urges. He's creating documentation, possibly for his own later enjoyment, possibly to share with others, possibly as evidence of his work. Serial killers and sadistic offenders often document their crimes for these reasons, needing to revisit and relive the experience of power over their victims. Traeger's cognitive abilities remain intact despite the asylum's chaos. He speaks coherently, plans methodically, and demonstrates understanding of Miles as threat requiring neutralization. This intact cognition distinguishes antisocial personality disorder from psychotic disorders. Traeger isn't delusional. He accurately perceives reality. He simply doesn't care about the harm he causes because empathy and conscience, the psychological structures that make most people care, are either absent or severely diminished in his personality structure. The ugly variant terminology Traeger uses, calling patients uglies and himself someone who helps them, reveals his dehumanization of others. This linguistic distancing is common in perpetrators of atrocities. By labeling victims as less than human, the perpetrator removes psychological barriers to violence. Traeger calling patients uglies allows him to torture them without cognitive dissonance, because they're not really people, just defective objects requiring correction or disposal. Traeger's death, falling onto the blade of his own circular saw when Miles escapes and pushes him, carries poetic justice but also diagnostic significance. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder often take significant risks, assume they're clever enough to avoid consequences, and underestimate their victims. Traeger was so confident in his control over Miles that he didn't adequately restrain him, so focused on his sadistic ritual that he missed signs of impending resistance. This overconfidence in one's own superiority is narcissistic feature often comorbid with antisocial personality disorder. The diagnosis for Traeger would be antisocial personality disorder with sadistic features, likely meeting criteria for psychopathy on assessment tools like the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. He demonstrates superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, manipulativeness, lack of remorse, shallow affect, callousness and lack of empathy, and criminal versatility. Unlike other variants whose mental illness makes them vulnerable, Traeger's personality disorder makes him predatory. He's not broken by Mount Massive. He thrives there. Traeger represents corporate evil given personal form. Murkoff Corporation as institution lacks capacity for sadism. It's a legal entity pursuing profit through unethical means. But corporations are run by people, and people like Traeger, individuals whose personalities allow them to view suffering as acceptable cost of business, staff those corporations and execute their agendas. Traeger is an aberration in Murkoff's structure. He's likely representative of the personality types the company attracts and promotes. His sadism is individual, but his presence at Mount Massive conducting torture is systemic. The twins shared psychotic disorder in symbiotic horror. You hear them before you see them, two voices speaking in eerie synchronization, finishing each other's sentences, moving with coordinated purpose that suggests single mind operating two bodies. The twins aren't actually twins by birth, but two male patients who have become psychologically fused, sharing delusions, completing each other's thoughts, and hunting together with disturbing cooperation. The game provides minimal canonical backstory for these characters, leaving much of their psychological analysis based on observable behavior rather than documented history. They serve Father Martin's apocalyptic vision, act as his enforcers, and demonstrate a rare psychiatric phenomenon where psychotic symptoms transfer between individuals in close association. Shared psychotic disorder, clinically termed folie à deux, or shared delusional disorder, occurs when a delusion develops in one person, then is transmitted to another person in close relationship with them. The primary individual, called the inducer, has genuine psychotic disorder. usually schizophrenia or delusional disorder. The secondary individual, called the acceptor, is typically more suggestible, dependent, and shares isolation or close proximity with the inducer that allows the delusion to be transmitted like ideological contagion. In the twins' case, identifying who is inducer and who is acceptor is impossible without individual history, but their shared delusion clearly centers on Father Martin's religious framework. They've adopted his belief that the wall rider represents divine entity, that Miles must be shown the truth, that their actions serve higher purpose. This delusion wasn't originally theirs. Martin transmitted it to them through the mechanisms of shared psychotic disorder, isolation within the asylum, repeated exposure to Martin's systematized delusional framework, and their own psychological vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to accepting beliefs they would typically reject. The twins' coordination suggests more than shared belief. It indicates merged identity boundaries. They move in synchronization, speak in overlapping patterns, and function as unit rather than two separate individuals cooperating. This psychological fusion goes beyond simply sharing delusion into territory of enmeshed identity, where each has lost clear sense of where self ends and other begins. This enmeshment occurs in certain relationship dynamics, particularly when individuals are isolated, traumatized, and lacking other social connections that would reinforce separate identities. Clinically, both twins would likely meet criteria for psychotic disorder, probably schizophrenia given the apparent persistence of their symptoms and the severity of their reality distortion. They demonstrate hallmark symptoms, delusions, the religious framework they've adopted from Martin, disorganized speech, the overlapping, synchronized talking patterns, and grossly disorganized behavior, hunting Miles through the asylum in service of incomprehensible religious purpose. Their negative symptoms, emotional flattening, reduced speech that isn't synchronized, are harder to assess given the game's limited interaction with them, but their overall presentation suggests severe psychotic illness in both individuals. The question arises, were the twins psychotic before becoming the twins, or did the asylum create both their psychosis and their psychological fusion? Mount Massive's records are incomplete, but the morphogenic engine's presence suggests both were exposed to procedures designed to induce psychiatric symptoms. They may have arrived with mild psychotic features or personality vulnerabilities, been subjected to the engine's trauma amplification, and found each other in the aftermath, two broken minds that fuse together because isolation and madness is unbearable, but shared madness creates twisted companionship. Their relationship demonstrates how psychotic disorders affect attachment. Healthy relationships involve two distinct individuals who maintain separate identities while creating intimacy. The twins' relationship has collapsed those boundaries entirely. They've created a shared self that exists between them, neither fully separate nor fully merged, functioning as psychological hybrid. This isn't romantic or sexual. The game provides no evidence of that dimension, but rather survival mechanism where neither could psychologically survive alone, so they created shared identity that distributes the burden of psychosis across two nervous systems. The twins' violence differs from other variants' violence in its coordinated, purposeful nature. Chris Walker hunts alone, driven by individual delusion about containment. Eddie Gluskin operates solo in his workshop, trapped in personal psychosis about marriage. The twins hunt as team, communicate nonverbally, and demonstrate planning that suggests their shared psychosis hasn't eliminated all executive function. They're dangerous not despite their coordination, but because of it. Their shared delusion amplifies rather than diminishes their threat. Their death scene, burned when Miles sets fire to the chapel where Father Martin has staged his final revelation, is tragic from psychiatric perspective. They die in service of delusion, still believing they're serving righteous purpose, never achieving insight into their condition. The fire consumes them while they're trying to prevent Miles from escaping, trying to complete Martin's mission, trying to preserve the delusional framework that gave their suffering meaning. They die as they lived in the asylum, psychotic, fused, and serving beliefs that existed only in diseased minds. The diagnosis for both twins would be psychotic disorder, likely schizophrenia, with the additional notation of shared psychotic disorder to indicate the transmission mechanism of their delusions. Treatment would require separating them. Shared psychotic disorder typically resolves in the acceptor when they're removed from the inducer's influence and provided antipsychotic medication. However, given the severity of their fusion and the apparent psychosis in both individuals, both would likely require long-term psychiatric treatment even if separated. The asylum's collapse and their deaths in the fire make this moot, their case studies in untreated psychosis progressing to its most severe manifestations. The twins represent Outlast's exploration of how isolation and shared trauma create pathological relationships. In the absence of healthy social connections, humans will form unhealthy ones rather than remain alone. The twins found each other in Mount Massive's hell and created a folie à deux that gave them purpose, identity, and companionship. Even though that shared reality was fundamentally false, their relationship was built on psychosis, but from their subjective experience, it was perhaps the only real thing in an asylum full of horrors they couldn't comprehend. Billy Hope, the unwilling host and catatonic victim. Billy Hope never speaks, never appears as character you can interact with, and yet his presence permeates the entire game. He is the morphogenic engine's only successful subject, the host body for the Walrider, kept alive in lucid dream state while nanomachines use his body as template and his unconscious mind as anchor. When you finally find him, Billy is in vegetative state, strapped to machinery, more medical experiment than human being. His autonomy stripped so completely that he exists only as biological platform for Murkoff's weapon. Billy's psychiatric condition before becoming the Walrider host is never fully detailed, but his presence in Mount Massive's underground lab suggests he was committed to the asylum with existing mental health issues. The morphogenic engine's purpose was to induce lucid dream states in psychiatric patients, then use those states to stimulate production of nanomachines through mechanisms the game describes only as hypnotic suggestion and the magic of science. Most patients exposed to the engine experience catastrophic psychiatric deterioration, their existing mental illnesses amplified until they became the variants. Billy alone remained neurologically viable for the experiment's completion, suggesting either his specific brain chemistry was compatible with the procedure, or he survived through sheer biological resilience what killed or broke others. Billy's condition by the time Miles encounters him resembles catatonia, but is more accurately described as a forced lucid dream state. While catatonic states typically involve marked decrease in reactivity to environment, with symptoms including stupor, catalepsy, and mutism, Billy's condition is artificially induced. He's kept in a perpetual lucid dream state, connected to the morphogenic engine and life support systems. He's immobile, unresponsive, showing no voluntary movement not because of psychiatric catatonia, but because he's locked in an engineered dream state from which he cannot wake. This isn't natural sleep or Organic catatonia. It's a forced neurological state where consciousness exists but is imprisoned within engineered dreams while his body is kept alive artificially. Catatonia can occur in schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and can be induced by medical conditions or substances. In Billy's case, likely induced by prolonged exposure to the morphogenic engine's effects. The ethical horror of Billy's situation transcends individual diagnosis. He's been reduced to biological substrate for the wall rider, his consciousness either locked in perpetual lucid nightmare or so dissociated from his physical body that he no longer experiences himself as embodied being. The documents suggest Billy has been in the engine for extended period, possibly months or years, experiencing engineered dreams designed to maximize the psychological states that produce nanomachines. This constitutes torture of highest order, not physical pain, but psychological violation so profound that it dissolves the boundaries of self. Medical coma differs from catatonia in that coma involves actual loss of consciousness. Billy's state is more horrifying because he may be conscious, trapped in a body that won't respond, forced to experience whatever the morphogenic engine shows him, unable to wake or escape. This parallels locked-in syndrome, where patients are fully conscious but unable to move or communicate, except possibly through eye movements. If Billy retains any awareness while appearing catatonic, his subjective experience would be indistinguishable from being buried alive, fully aware but completely imprisoned in unresponsive flesh. The wall rider complicates Billy's diagnosis further. The nanomachine swarm uses Billy as host, responding to his unconscious thoughts and emotions. When the wall rider attacks, is that Billy's agency or the nanomachines operating autonomously? The game suggests the wall rider acts on Billy's unconscious impulses, his rage at his captors, his pain from the experimentation, his desire for revenge or release. If true, Billy possesses agency, but only unconsciously. His trauma response is weaponized into a killing tool he doesn't consciously control. This represents a horrifying perversion of psychiatric treatment. Therapeutic techniques like dream analysis and exposure therapy aim to access unconscious material to process trauma safely. The morphogenic engine does the opposite. It accesses unconscious material to exploit it, to weaponize trauma responses rather than heal them. Billy's unconscious mind, the deep psychological structures that normally remain inaccessible, have been hacked and turned into control system for bioweapon. His interiority has become Murkoff's property. When Miles unplugs Billy from the morphogenic engine, he's performing euthanasia. Billy's body has been kept alive artificially, his brain forced into states no human brain should experience, his personhood dissolved into experimental protocol. Death is mercy, though mercy that comes too late to prevent the suffering already endured. Billy's death should end the wall rider. No host means no anchor for the nanomachines. Instead, the wall rider transfers to Miles, suggesting the consciousness that was Billy Hope has been so thoroughly absorbed into the nanomachine swarm that it no longer requires the original body. This creates existential question. What remains of Billy after his body dies? Is his consciousness uploaded into the wall rider, distributed across millions of nanomachines, experiencing some form of post-biological existence? Or did Billy's consciousness dissolve during the experiments, leaving only neurological patterns the wall rider learned to replicate? The game doesn't answer, but from psychiatric perspective, Billy Hope as coherent self likely ceased to exist long before his body died. The prolonged catatonia, the months or years of induced lucid nightmares, the complete dissociation from his physical form. These aren't conditions people return from with intact identity. Billy's diagnosis at admission to Mount Massive is unknown, but by the time Miles finds him, catatonic states secondary to prolonged psychological trauma and induced dream states, possible persistent vegetative state if awareness has been lost, dissociative disorder if any fragment of consciousness persists, and profound dehumanization through medical experimentation. He's been reduced from person to object, from patient to equipment, from Billy Hope to the host. His case represents Outlast's darkest condemnation of the psychiatric industrial complex. Billy wasn't treated, wasn't helped, wasn't even acknowledged as human being deserving of dignity. He was raw material for weapon development, his mental illness making him vulnerable to exploitation, his lack of social connections or advocacy meaning no one would look for him, no one would question his treatment, no one would intervene as Murkoff's doctors destroyed him in the name of research. Miles Upshur, investigative compulsion and acute trauma response. Miles Upshur arrives at Mount Massive Asylum with camera and conviction, an investigative journalist following anonymous tip about illegal activities at the remote facility. He's not a patient, doesn't have pre-existing psychiatric conditions documented in the game, and represents the neurotypical lens through which players experience the variant's pathologies. But by the time Miles escapes, or fails to escape, he's no longer neurotypical. He's experienced acute trauma sufficient to induce PTSD, witnessed atrocities that would shatter most people's worldview, and ultimately becomes host to the Wall Rider, losing his bodily autonomy in the process. Miles's initial psychological profile demonstrates traits common in investigative journalists: high tolerance for risk, strong sense of justice, compulsive need to expose truth, and perhaps insufficient self-preservation instinct. The decision to enter Mount Massive alone at night after the anonymous tipster specifically warned about human rights violations suggests either remarkable courage or risk-taking behavior that borders on recklessness. Healthy fear responses would make most people call authorities rather than investigate personally. Miles bypasses those fear responses in service of getting the story. This compulsive truth-seeking might indicate obsessive personality traits. Not obsessive-compulsive disorder, but obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, characterized by perfectionism, need for control, preoccupation with rules and details, and devotion to work at the expense of personal relationships. Miles's entire identity appears built around journalism. He has camera, notebook, determination to document everything, and willingness to risk death for the story. This single-minded focus serves him in surviving the asylum. His journalist training keeps him observing, recording, thinking analytically even in extreme circumstances, but also suggests someone whose sense of self is entirely wrapped up in professional identity. The acute trauma Miles experiences at Mount Massive would induce PTSD in virtually anyone. He witnesses multiple murders, is directly targeted for killing dozens of times, experiences physical torture from Traeger, narrowly escapes death repeatedly, and sees evidence of systematic human experimentation. Each of these constitutes potential traumatic stressor. Experiencing them consecutively over the course of a single night creates cumulative trauma that overwhelms psychological defenses. Acute stress disorder would be Miles's immediate diagnosis during and shortly after the Mount Massive incident. This disorder occurs within 3 days to 1 month after trauma exposure and includes intrusive symptoms, intrusive memories, distressing dreams, flashbacks, negative mood, dissociative symptoms, altered sense of reality, inability to remember aspects of trauma, avoidance symptoms, and arousal symptoms, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle, concentration problems. Miles would experience all of these. The intrusive memories would be unavoidable given what he witnessed. The dissociative symptoms explain why he keeps filming. The camera creates psychological distance, making the horror feel less immediate by experiencing it through lens rather than directly. If Miles survived Mount Massive with his autonomy intact, he would almost certainly develop full PTSD after the acute stress disorder period ended. The trauma is severe, prolonged, and involved both life threat and witnessing others' deaths. His PTSD would include re-experiencing symptoms, nightmares of the variants chasing him, flashbacks triggered by darkness or confined spaces, avoidance of trauma reminders, negative changes in cognition and mood, including inability to trust others or feel safe, and persistent arousal symptoms making him constantly vigilant for threats that no longer exist. The game's ending complicates Miles's psychological trajectory catastrophically. After unplugging Billy Hope and believing he's ended the Wall Rider threat, Miles attempts to leave the asylum only to be shot by Murkoff's security team. As he lies dying, the Wall Rider enters his body, making him the new host. Miles's consciousness persists. The Wall Rider speaks through him, suggesting some fusion of identities, but his autonomy is compromised. He's become what Billy was, biological anchor for nanomachine swarm, his body no longer fully his own. This unwilling possession represents ultimate violation of autonomy. Miles's sense of self, his I that observes and acts in the world, is no longer sole occupant of his body. The Wall Rider shares that space, uses his flesh, acts through his form. From a psychiatric perspective, this parallels dissociative identity disorder, where multiple personalities share one body, except in Miles's case, one of those personalities is actually a weapon composed of nanomachines using his consciousness as control interface. Whether Miles retains any control or exists only as prisoner in his own body is unclear. The Whistleblower DLC's ending shows Miles's body, now hosting the Wall Rider, killing Murkoff's security forces as the entity escapes the asylum. Is Miles conscious during this? Does he experience the killings, or has his consciousness been suppressed? Can he communicate with the Wall Rider, negotiate with it, or is he simply biological resource being consumed? These questions have no clear answers, but from Miles's subjective experience, this would be either catatonic nightmare, fully aware but unable to control his body, or dissociative fugue state, where he experiences gaps in memory, regaining awareness only after the Wall Rider has acted through him. Miles's ultimate diagnosis depends on his fate post-possession. If he maintains consciousness while the Wall Rider uses his body, severe dissociative disorder, specifically possession form trance disorder, complicated by the possession being literal rather than psychological. If his consciousness has been suppressed, persistent vegetative state, or catatonic state similar to Billy Hope's condition. Either way, Miles' Upshur as autonomous person has effectively ended. The body survives, but the self is either imprisoned or dissolved. His camera, the tool that defined his identity and purpose, becomes artifact of his last autonomous moments. Throughout the game, Miles records everything, narrating observations and maintaining journalist perspective even in extremis. The camera is both psychological defense and professional compulsion. By filming the horror, he maintains some cognitive distance from it, reframes it as story he's investigating rather than nightmare he's trapped in. When he becomes the wall rider host, the camera is abandoned. Miles no longer observes, he's become part of what should be observed. The journalist transformed into the story. Miles represents Outlast's thesis that no one emerges from Mount Massive intact. Unlike Silent Hill's protagonists who can achieve redemptive or integrative endings, Miles has no such possibility. His investigation condemned him to death or possession. His journalistic compulsion led him into a trap he couldn't escape, and his trauma never gets opportunity to become PTSD because his consciousness is co-opted before he can even begin processing what happened to him. He's a case study in how quickly normalcy can be destroyed, how trauma doesn't require pre-existing vulnerability, and how institutional evil consumes even those who arrive to expose it. Wayland Park, Moral Injury and Survivor's Guilt. Wayland Park isn't a patient. He's a software engineer employed by Murkoff Corporation who worked at Mount Massive until his conscience overrode his employment. When Wayland realized the morphogenic engine's true purpose and the human suffering it caused, he became the anonymous tipster who sent Miles Upshur the email that brought the journalist to the asylum. Murkoff discovered his whistleblowing, committed him to Mount Massive as a patient despite his lack of psychiatric illness, and intended to silence him permanently through the same experimental procedures used on actual patients. Wayland's psychological journey through whistleblower DLC demonstrates how moral injury develops in individuals who participate, even peripherally, in atrocities. Moral injury occurs when someone perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent actions that violate their moral code, creating psychological damage distinct from standard PTSD. While PTSD stems from fear and threat to physical safety, moral injury stems from guilt, shame, and spiritual existential crisis. Wayland feels responsible for the suffering the morphogenic engine caused because he helped build the software that controlled it, even though he didn't design the experiments or authorize the torture. This guilt manifests throughout Whistleblower as Wayland repeatedly encounters the consequences of his indirect participation. Every variant he sees, every mutilated corpse, every evidence of torture reinforces his belief that he's complicit in creating Mount Massive's hell. This isn't irrational guilt. Wayland did contribute to the engine's function, even if he didn't understand its full purpose initially. His whistleblowing was an attempt at redemption, but from his psychological perspective, sending one journalist doesn't counterbalance his months of work enabling Murkoff's atrocities. The shame component of moral injury appears in Wayland's desperation to reach his wife and children. He carries their photos, references them constantly, and draws motivation to survive from need to reunite with his family. But underlying this motivation is fear that he's become someone his family wouldn't recognize, that his complicity has corrupted him, that he doesn't deserve their love anymore. This shame-driven fear is characteristic of moral injury, where individuals feel they've violated their own identity, become something monstrous despite maintaining external appearance of normalcy. Wayland's acute trauma during the DLC is comparable to Miles's experience. He's hunted, witnesses murders, experiences Eddie Gluskin's torture directly, and must navigate the asylum's otherworld manifestations. But Wayland's response differs from Miles's in a crucial way. Wayland already carries guilt before the trauma begins. Miles was innocent investigator thrust into nightmare. Wayland believes he deserves the nightmare, that his suffering is karmic consequence of his participation in Murkoff's crimes. This self-blame complicates his trauma responses, potentially making his eventual PTSD more severe because he won't allow himself the compassion and self-care that trauma survivors need for recovery. The Eddie Gluskin encounter is Wayland's most severe traumatic experience. Eddie captures him, straps him to operating table, and prepares to perform forced gender reassignment surgery without anesthetic. Wayland escapes before the surgery occurs, but the psychological impact of that near miss would be catastrophic. He was moments away from being mutilated by a psychotic individual who called him darling while threatening to cut his genitals. This experience would create trauma symptoms specifically around bodily autonomy, medical settings, and interpersonal trust. Sexual trauma, even when not completed, induces specific PTSD presentations. Wayland would likely develop trauma-related sexual dysfunction, hypervigilance around physical contact, intrusive memories of being restrained and helpless, and possibly dissociative responses during intimacy with his wife. The fact that Eddie's motivation was ostensibly creating a bride adds gender-related psychological complications. Wayland's sense of masculinity, his body image, his sexual identity all threatened by Eddie's delusional intent to surgically transform him. Survivor's guilt compounds Wayland's moral injury. He escapes Mount Massive when so many others, patients, staff, Miles himself, don't survive. Wayland's status as whistleblower gives his survival meaning, but it doesn't erase the guilt. He'll likely experience intrusive thoughts about why he survived when others didn't, particularly regarding Miles. Wayland sent Miles into Mount Massive knowing the facility was dangerous. Miles died, or worse, because of that email. Wayland bears indirect responsibility, and his conscience will torture him with that knowledge indefinitely. Unlike Miles, Wayland achieves physical escape. He makes it outside, reunites with his family in the DLC's epilogue, and survives with bodily autonomy intact. But psychological escape is different from physical escape. Wayland carries Mount Massive with him in his memories, his guilt, his trauma responses, his moral injury. His PTSD will manifest in nightmares about Eddie's operating table, flashbacks triggered by enclosed spaces or darkness, hypervigilance that makes him constantly scan for threats, and numbing that makes it difficult to feel positive emotions even with his family. The moral injury creates additional complication. PTSD can be treated effectively with trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, and medication. Moral injury is more resistant to treatment because it involves damage to one's moral identity, not just fear conditioning. Wayland will need to process not just the trauma of what happened to him, but the guilt and shame of his role in enabling what happened to others. This requires different therapeutic approach, possibly involving meaning-making interventions or spiritually integrated therapy that helps him find redemptive purpose without minimizing his legitimate regret. Wayland's diagnosis would be acute stress disorder initially, progressing to PTSD after 1 month, with complicated grief regarding Miles and the patients who died. Moral injury requiring its own therapeutic attention, and likely adjustment disorder as he attempts to reintegrate into family life after profound trauma. His prognosis is better than most characters in Outlast because he has protective factors, loving family, financial resources to access treatment, intelligence, and insight that will help him engage with therapy, but his recovery will be prolonged and difficult. Wayland represents what happens when someone with intact conscience encounters institutional evil. He wasn't mentally ill, wasn't predisposed to trauma, wasn't seeking danger. He was a software engineer who took a job, discovered his employer was torturing people, made the ethical choice to expose it, and paid catastrophic psychological price for that choice. His story condemns not just Murkoff Corporation, but systems that punish whistleblowers, that treat ethical objection as betrayal, that destroy people for having conscience. The morphogenic engine weaponized psychiatry as central horror. The variants are individual case studies, but the morphogenic engine is the systemic pathology that created them. This machine, designed by former Nazi scientist Dr. Rudolf Wernicke and refined by Murkoff Corporation, represents the logical endpoint of psychiatric treatment divorced from ethics, therapeutic techniques transformed into torture instruments, and the medicalization of human suffering for profit and warfare. The engine's methodology exploits legitimate psychiatric and neurological phenomena. Lucid dreaming is real, the state where dreamers become aware they're dreaming while maintaining sleep. Research has explored lucid dreaming's therapeutic applications for nightmare disorder, creativity enhancement, and skill practice. The morphogenic engine takes this natural phenomenon and weaponizes it, forcing patients into lucid dream states not for therapeutic benefit, but to induce psychological conditions that appear to stimulate production of nanomachines through processes the game deliberately leaves mysterious, described only as combining hypnotic imagery with what Dr. Wernicke called the magic of science. The exact mechanism connecting lucid dreams to nano-machine production is intentionally vague in the game's lore, presented as proprietary science bordering on science fiction, but the psychological destruction the engine causes is portrayed with uncomfortable realism, forcing someone to experience recurring nightmares they cannot wake from constitutes torture. The psychological impact would be catastrophic. Reality becomes unreliable when you can't distinguish waking from dreaming, when nightmares have same sensory quality as lived experience, when sleep offers no respite because sleep is where the torture occurs. Patients subjected to the engine would develop symptoms resembling depersonalization, derealization disorder, where individuals feel detached from themselves or experience the world as unreal. When you can't trust that your waking experiences are real, when dreams feel as concrete as reality, the psychological grounding that allows normal functioning dissolves. You're perpetually uncertain whether current experience is authentic or engineered, whether the suffering you feel is organic or induced, whether your thoughts are your own or implanted by the engine's protocols. The engine also creates conditioned trauma responses. Classical conditioning pairs neutral stimuli with traumatic experiences until the neutral stimulus alone triggers trauma response. The engine's imagery, whatever specific nightmares it generates, becomes conditioned stimulus that triggers profound distress. Patients exposed to the engine would develop PTSD, where the traumatic event isn't a single incident but repeated, inescapable, engineered psychological attacks that their minds process as real threats. Dr. Wernicke's background adds historical horror to the engine's conceptual horror. Nazi medical experiments are infamous for their brutality and complete disregard for human dignity, conducted by physicians who perverted medical knowledge into tools of genocide. That Wernicke escaped accountability after World War II and continued his psychiatric experiments under American corporate sponsorship parallels real-world Operation Paperclip, where Nazi scientists were recruited by U.S. government despite their war crimes. This historical grounding makes the morphogenic engine feel less like pure fiction and more like extrapolation from actual atrocities. Murkoff Corporation's motivations are explicitly economic and military. The morphogenic engine produces the wall rider, and the wall rider is weaponizable, a nano-machine swarm that can kill targets, infiltrate secure locations, and operate beyond conventional warfare limitations. The psychiatric patients are raw materials, their suffering is production cost, and their deaths or permanent psychological destruction are acceptable losses in service of creating marketable military technology. This framing transforms Mount Massive from hospital to factory, patients from people receiving care to inventory being processed. The ethical violations are comprehensive. Informed consent is absent. Patients admitted for psychiatric treatment weren't told they'd be subjected to experimental procedures. Beneficence is violated. The procedures harm rather than help patients. Non-maleficence is obliterated. The engine deliberately induces severe psychological damage. Justice is perverted. Vulnerable populations are targeted because their lack of social power makes abuse easier to conduct without accountability. Every principle of medical ethics is systematically violated. The engine represents what psychiatry becomes when separated from humanistic concern for patients' well-being. Psychiatric knowledge is powerful. Understanding how minds break allows both healing and destruction. The same techniques that treat PTSD can induce it. The same drugs that stabilize psychosis can create it. The same therapeutic relationships that build trust can exploit vulnerability. Psychiatry requires ethical foundation because without it, the field's tools become weapons. The morphogenic engine is unethical psychiatry made concrete, the nightmare version of what happens when medical knowledge serves profit and power rather than healing. The variants created by the engine are living evidence of psychiatry's potential for harm. Each patient had pre-existing vulnerabilities, trauma histories, developing psychotic symptoms, personality disorders, depression, that under ethical treatment might have improved or stabilized. Instead, the engine amplified every vulnerability, transformed manageable conditions into catastrophic pathology, and created individuals so damaged they became dangerous. The engine didn't cure mental illness, it weaponized it, turned patients into living weapons whose suffering became operational capability. Mount Massive Asylum's collapse demonstrates that weaponized madness cannot be controlled. Murkoff believed they could contain the engine's effects, could maintain the facility's security, could manage the risk of patients who'd been deliberately driven psychotic. The Wall Rider's emergence and subsequent outbreak proved that assumption wrong. Once you systematically destroy people's sanity, you cannot predict or control the results. The variants killed staff, destroyed security measures, and transformed the asylum from containment facility to slaughterhouse. Murkoff created chaos they couldn't contain, horror they couldn't manage, and consequences they couldn't escape. The engine's legacy extends beyond Mount Massive. If Murkoff successfully created the Wall Rider despite the facility's destruction, the methodology can be replicated. Other corporations, other governments, other actors willing to torture psychiatric patients for technological gain now have proof of concept. The horror is an isolated incident but precedent, template for future atrocities where vulnerable populations are fed into experimental machinery and human suffering is refined into profit. The systemic diagnosis, institutional pathology, individual patients receive individual diagnoses, but Mount Massive Asylum itself requires systemic diagnosis. The facility exhibits characteristics consistent with institutional pathology, a concept from sociology and organizational psychology describing how institutions develop dysfunctional, harmful patterns that persist despite causing obvious damage. The first symptom is mission drift. Mount Massive ostensibly existed to provide psychiatric care, but its actual function was human experimentation. This drift from stated purpose to hidden purpose creates institutional cognitive dissonance requiring elaborate justifications. Staff must rationalize their participation in torture by reframing it as research, by dehumanizing patients, by focusing on abstractions like national security or scientific progress, rather than concrete suffering they're causing. The second symptom is normalization of deviance. The morphogenic engine's use represents extreme violation of medical ethics, but within Mount Massive's culture, it became normal. Staff discussed it in routine terms, recorded data systematically, and processed patient deterioration as expected outcomes rather than emergencies requiring intervention. This normalization occurs in institutions through gradual escalation. First small ethical compromises that seem justifiable, then larger compromises that build on precedent until atrocity becomes protocol. The third symptom is selection for compliance. Murkoff didn't hire staff who would object to torturing patients. They selected for individuals who would rationalize participation, prioritize career advancement over ethics, or possess antisocial traits making them indifferent to suffering. Richard Traeger represents extreme version of this selection bias, but every staff member working at Mount Massive passed through filters selecting for compliance with unethical directives. The institutional culture created by this selection process actively punished dissent, as Wayland Park's fate demonstrates. The fourth symptom is information control. Mount Massive operated in isolation, with limited external oversight and deliberate concealment of its actual activities. Staff signed restrictive non-disclosure agreements. Murkoff actively suppressed information about the facility's purpose, and the remote location minimized chance of unauthorized observation. This secrecy isn't incidental. It's necessary because institutional pathology requires hiding from accountability structures that would identify and terminate harmful patterns. The fifth symptom is victim blaming. The patients harmed by the engine are framed as problematic, dangerous, or deserving their treatment through language that shifts responsibility from institution to victims, calling them variants rather than patients or victims linguistically marks them as aberrant, implying their condition is inherent rather than inflicted. This linguistic distancing allows staff to avoid confronting institutional responsibility for creating the very pathology they claim to study. These institutional symptoms create an environment where individual-level mental illness becomes weaponizable. The variance disorders aren't purely organic. They're produced through systematic institutional abuse. This makes Mount Massive a case study in iatrogenic illness, where medical intervention causes disease rather than treating it. Every variance condition was made worse by the facility that supposedly existed to help them, making the institution itself the primary pathogen. The asylum's physical deterioration mirrors its moral deterioration. When Miles arrives, the facility is already collapsing. Blood on walls, bodies in corridors, security systems failing, containment breached. This environmental decay reflects what happens when institutional pathology reaches terminal stage. The organization can no longer maintain basic functions. Protective systems collapse, and chaos consumes the structure that generated it. Mount Massive didn't fall because of external attack. It fell because institutions built on systematic abuse eventually destroy themselves. The ethics of horror when stigma becomes gameplay. Outlast exists in tension between effective horror design and responsible mental illness representation. The game creates fear by making mentally ill individuals into threats, which risks reinforcing stigma that people with psychiatric conditions are dangerous. This isn't theoretical concern. Measurable stigma against mental illness increases when media portrays psychiatric patients as violent, making real people less likely to seek treatment for fear of being viewed as dangerous. The game mitigates this somewhat through context. The variants aren't inherently dangerous because of their mental illness. They're dangerous because Murkoff Corporation deliberately engineered their conditions to produce danger. The game condemns the institution, not the patients. Every document Miles finds reinforces that these people were victims first, threats second. Their violence is consequence of systematic abuse, not inherent feature of their diagnoses. However, this contextual framing doesn't entirely resolve the tension. Regardless of narrative justification, the gameplay consists of running from mentally ill individuals in an asylum setting, hiding from them, watching them kill, and occasionally causing their deaths. The immediate emotional experience is one of fear directed at psychiatric patients, even if the intellectual framework blames the institution. Horror games rely on visceral response, and visceral response doesn't pause to consider context. The asylum horror subgenre has troubled history. Outlast is part of tradition, including films like Session 9 and games like Amnesia, where psychiatric facilities become settings for terror and their patients become monsters. This tradition draws on real fears, the historical reality of asylum abuse, society's discomfort with mental illness, anxieties about losing sanity, but risks exploiting and reinforcing those fears rather than examining them critically. Outlast's use of actual psychiatric conditions for its antagonists adds complexity. Chris Walker isn't generic crazy person. He has specific trauma history and diagnostic presentation. Eddie Gluskin's psychosis has documented etiology. This specificity could educate players about mental health conditions, but it could also create associations between specific diagnoses and violence. Players might unconsciously develop bias that PTSD makes people murderous, or that abuse survivors become abusers, even though statistics show these connections are exceptions rather than rules. The game also lacks positive representation of mental illness to counterbalance the threatening portrayal. Every character with psychiatric condition is either dangerous or dead. There are no successfully treated patients, no staff members managing their own mental health conditions competently, no examples of mental illness that don't result in tragedy. This creates impression that psychiatric diagnosis equals doom, that treatment is impossible, that mental illness inevitably leads to catastrophe. Some argue horror games shouldn't bear responsibility for balanced mental health representation, that their purpose is entertainment through fear rather than education or advocacy. This argument has merit but isn't absolute. Horror doesn't exist in vacuum. It shapes cultural attitudes, influences how audiences view real issues, and can either challenge or reinforce societal prejudices. Outlast is effective horror, but effectiveness doesn't exempt it from criticism about its potential social impact. The counter-argument is that Outlast's true horror is institutional, not individual. The game is more frightening as critique of corporate exploitation, medical ethics violations, and systemic abuse than as collection of scary mental patients. Reading it this way, the variant's mental illness is symptom of deeper disease, the pathology of profit-driven medicine, of government-sponsored torture, of capitalism that treats human suffering as exploitable resource. This reading makes the game progressive rather than stigmatizing, a condemnation of systems that create and exploit vulnerability. Both readings coexist. Outlast is simultaneously effective horror that risks reinforcing mental illness stigma and sophisticated critique of institutional evil that uses horror genre to condemn psychiatric abuse. The game's meaning isn't fixed. It emerges from interaction between game text, player interpretation, and cultural context. Some players will finish Outlast with reinforced fear of mentally ill individuals. Others will finish with reinforced distrust of institutions claiming to provide care. Both outcomes are possible from the same game. What's certain is that Outlast portrays mental illness with more specificity and context than most horror games. The variants have histories, their conditions have explanations, and the narrative consistently frames them as victims. This is significant improvement over horror games, where mental illness is simply shorthand for dangerous and unpredictable. But it's not complete solution to the ethical tension inherent in making psychiatric patients into monsters, even monsters created by institutional abuse. The uncomfortable truth is that horror as genre often relies on othering, creating something different, threatening, incomprehensible to generate fear. Mental illness has historically served that othering function because psychiatric conditions do make people behave differently, do create experiences that neurotypical individuals struggle to understand. Using mental illness for horror is effective precisely because it taps into genuine anxiety about losing one's mind, about reality becoming unreliable, about the self dissolving. But effectiveness doesn't equal ethics, and the question of whether horror games should use mental illness as scare tactic remains contested. Outlast doesn't resolve this tension, but it does engage with it more thoughtfully than many genre entries. The game wants players to fear the variants, but also to recognize their humanity, to understand their victims, to direct anger at Murkoff rather than at the broken people Murkoff created. Whether it succeeds in this dual purpose depends partly on the individual player's engagement with the game's context versus their visceral response to its threats. Conclusion: the madness was always human. Mount Massive Asylum is burning. The wall rider has escaped. Miles Upsher's body walks out controlled by nanomachines, and somewhere behind Murkoff's corporate walls, executives are already calculating whether the experiment's results justify the costs. The variants are dead or dying, their suffering finally ended by fire or violence or mercy. Wayland Park drives away with his family, carrying trauma he'll never fully articulate. And the morphogenic engine, that machine that transforms psychiatric treatment into weapon, sits silent in underground laboratories, its methodology documented, ready to be replicated by the next corporation or government willing to torture for profit. Every diagnosis cataloged here, every PTSD case, every psychotic break, every personality disorder, every trauma response emerged from human decisions. The Wall Rider is science fiction, but the suffering that created it is documentary. Real psychiatric patients have been subjected to experimental procedures without consent. Real institutions have prioritized research over care. Real corporations have treated vulnerable populations as exploitable resources. Real people with mental illness have been dehumanized, abandoned, and destroyed by systems claiming to help them. Outlast horror works because it's grounded in actual psychiatric presentations, because the variant's conditions follow documented patterns, because the institutional abuse portrayed parallels historical atrocities. The game exaggerates for dramatic effect. The morphogenic engine's nanomachine production is fantasy, but the core horror of weaponized psychiatry is real. Mental health treatment can be tool of liberation or tool of control, depending entirely on who wields it and for what purpose. The characters we've diagnosed aren't monsters by nature. They're casualties of a system that identified their vulnerabilities and exploited them until vulnerability became weaponized pathology. Chris Walker should have received trauma-informed care for his PTSD and been honored for his service. Eddie Gluskin deserved therapy for his complex trauma from childhood abuse and protection from further harm. Father Martin needed antipsychotic medication and compassionate treatment for his delusional disorder. Billy Hope should never have been strapped to machinery and tortured into catatonia. Every variant had a moment before Mount Massive where intervention could have changed their trajectory, where proper treatment could have prevented tragedy. The morphogenic engine represents psychiatry's darkest potential, the recognition that the same knowledge used to heal minds can be used to break them, that therapeutic techniques become torture when applied without consent or care, that understanding human psychology creates power that can serve liberation or domination. Dr. Wernicke brought Nazi experimentation methodology to American corporate funding, and Murkoff Corporation eagerly applied it because profit motive overrode ethical constraint. The engine is an aberration in psychiatric history. Its extreme example of recurring pattern where vulnerable populations become experimental subjects for institutions that view human suffering as data rather than tragedy. Miles Upsher's fate crystallizes Outlast's thesis about vulnerability and exploitation. He arrived as observer, journalist maintaining professional distance, neurotypical individual documenting others' pathology, but Mount Massive consumed him anyway, first inflicting acute trauma, then claiming his body as host for the wall rider. His autonomy dissolved not because he was mentally ill, but because he entered system designed to destroy autonomy, to reduce persons to biology, to transform consciousness into tool. If even someone like Miles, educated, resourced, initially healthy, couldn't escape intact, what chance did psychiatric patients have? Wayland Park's survival offers slim hope, but also demonstrates hope's limitations. He escaped physically, reunited with family, achieved the happy ending denied to nearly everyone else in the game, but he carries Mount Massive inside him, in flashbacks and nightmares, in moral injury that questions his worth, in survivor's guilt that asks why he lived when others died. His escape proves survival is possible, but his ongoing trauma proves survival isn't the same as being saved. The asylum released his body, but kept pieces of his mind, and he'll spend years in therapy trying to reclaim them. The variants we've diagnosed represent spectrum of psychiatric conditions, affective disorders, trauma disorders, psychotic disorders, personality disorders, dissociative states, but they share common etiology of institutional harm. Their individual vulnerabilities differed, their breaking points varied, their specific symptom presentations followed different patterns, but the underlying cause remained constant. Mount Massive Asylum took broken people and broke them further in service of creating weapons. The individual diagnoses matter for understanding their specific presentations, but the systemic diagnosis matters more for understanding why those presentations became lethal. Shared psychotic disorder between the twins, Father Martin's delusional disorder, spreading through cult dynamics, the isolation that intensified every variant's symptoms. These demonstrate how environmental factors shape mental illness progression. Psychiatric conditions don't exist in vacuum. They're influenced by social context, physical environment, available support systems, and institutional responses. Mount Massive's environment was designed to worsen mental illness, to remove every protective factor and amplify every risk factor, creating conditions where psychiatric deterioration became inevitable. The game's documents reinforce this repeatedly. Patient files show individuals admitted with manageable conditions who deteriorated after engine exposure. Security reports track escalating violence corresponding with increased experimental procedures. Staff communications reveal awareness that what they're doing is harmful, followed by rationalizations about necessity and progress. The paper trail Mount Massive left behind reads like evidence in war crimes tribunal, systematic documentation of systematic abuse, written in bureaucratic language that distances authors from moral weight of what they're recording. Richard Traeger embodies the perpetrator mentality that enables institutional atrocities. His antisocial personality disorder and sadistic features made him psychologically suited for torturing patients, but his corporate position gave him opportunity and authority. Institutions don't create people like Traeger, but they attract them, promote them, and empower them when the institution's goals align with their pathology. Murkoff needed employees who wouldn't balk at human experimentation, and Traeger's personality made him asset rather than liability. His presence at Mount Massive was an accident. It was selection bias functioning exactly as designed. The wall rider complicates every diagnosis by introducing literal rather than metaphorical possession. In standard psychiatric presentation, patients experiencing possession states have dissociative disorder. Their belief they're controlled by external entity is symptom of illness. But Billy Hope and later Miles Upshur are actually possessed by nanomachine swarm using their bodies as interface. This transforms what should be psychiatric symptom into physical reality, blurring boundary between mental illness and literal phenomenon. The horror of actual possession exceeds the horror of believing you're possessed, because the former offers no treatment, no cognitive restructuring that will restore autonomy, no therapy that addresses actual rather than perceived loss of control. Billy Hope's extended catatonia while serving as wall rider host represents ultimate dehumanization. His consciousness reduced to biological platform, his personhood irrelevant except as anchor for nanomachines, his suffering unmeasured because he's no longer viewed as person experiencing suffering. When Miles unplugs him, Billy's body dies almost immediately, suggesting he was maintained artificially for so long that his biological systems couldn't function independently anymore. He'd been converted from person to equipment so thoroughly that removing external support meant death within moments. The ethics of that mercy killing deserve examination. Miles ended Billy's suffering, but did so without Billy's consent because Billy was catatonic and incapable of consent. In medical ethics, this creates impossible dilemma. Continuing life support prolongs suffering, but terminating it without consent violates autonomy. Miles chose to end suffering over preserving life, made judgment that Billy's existence as wall rider host was suffering rather than living. The game frames this as heroic, but it's complicated heroism built on making irreversible choice for someone incapable of choosing. Outlast's mental illness representation is both its greatest strength and its most problematic element. The diagnostic specificity creates authenticity that amplifies horror. These aren't generic crazy people, but individuals with recognizable psychiatric presentations, whose symptoms follow documented patterns. This authenticity makes variants sympathetic, helps players understand their victims, grounds supernatural horror in psychological reality, but it also associates specific diagnoses with violence, makes psychiatric conditions into threat mechanics, and risks reinforcing stigma that mentally ill individuals are dangerous. The game attempts to mitigate stigma through context, consistently framing variants as victims and condemning institutional abuse rather than individual pathology. Every document players find reinforces that these people were harmed, that their violence is consequence rather than cause, that Murkoff bears responsibility for creating dangerous individuals from treatable patients. But context exists in tension with gameplay experience, and visceral fear response to variance may override intellectual understanding that they're victims. Horror games create fear first and context second, meaning even progressive narrative framing may not prevent reinforcement of mental illness stigma. This tension is irresolvable within horror genre's constraints. Horror requires threats, and making mentally ill individuals into threats inevitably risks stigmatization regardless of narrative context. Outlast is more thoughtful about this than most horror games, providing psychiatric specificity and institutional critique that elevate it beyond simple asylum full of crazy people tropes. But thoughtfulness doesn't eliminate ethical concerns, and the game exists in uncomfortable space between effective horror and responsible representation. The absence of the supernatural distinguishes Outlast from Silent Hill while creating different ethical implications. Silent Hill's monsters are psychological manifestations, externalized guilt and trauma that attack protagonists. The variants are actual people, psychiatric patients whose illness was weaponized but whose humanity persists. This makes Outlast horror more grounded, but also more ethically fraught. Silent Hill asks you to fear your own psychology made physical, while Outlast asks you to fear other people's mental illness made dangerous. The former explores internal horror. The latter risks othering actual vulnerable populations. Yet Outlast succeeds in creating genuinely frightening experience precisely because it grounds horror in psychiatric authenticity. The variants are terrifying because their behaviors follow patterns of actual mental illness, because their violence emerges from documented trauma responses, because players recognize something real beneath the horror game: exaggeration. Father Martin's serene conviction in his delusion is frightening because delusional disorder actually looks like that: calm certainty that cannot be reasoned with. Eddie Gluskin's dissociation from his victim's suffering is frightening because trauma can actually create that dissociation. Chris Walker's mission fixation is frightening because PTSD with psychotic features actually produces that kind of single-minded violence justified by delusion behavior. The game teaches psychiatric literacy through horror mechanics, making players recognize symptom presentations even if they don't know clinical terminology. After playing Outlast, players can identify psychotic delusion, recognize trauma-driven violence, understand how isolation worsens mental illness. This education happens experientially rather than didactically, through encountering variants and reading documents rather than through exposition. Whether this education reduces stigma or reinforces it depends on whether players generalize from psychiatric patients tortured by Murkoff become dangerous to psychiatric patients are dangerous, or recognize the crucial intervening variable of institutional abuse. The morphogenic engine's legacy extends beyond Mount Massive. If the methodology works, if torturing psychiatric patients produces weaponizable results, then economic incentives will drive replication. Murkoff Corporation operated one facility, but the research could be sold, stolen, or independently rediscovered by other actors. The precedent has been established that human suffering can be refined into military technology, and precedents invite replication. Mount Massive might burn, but the idea behind Mount Massive survives in documents, in Murkoff's servers, in the minds of researchers who saw the Wall Rider and recognized its strategic potential. This is Outlast's deepest horror. not individual variants, but systemic incentives that make Mount Massive logical rather than aberrant. Capitalism rewards profit regardless of how profit is generated. Military contractors reward effective weapons regardless of development costs. Psychiatric patients are vulnerable, socially isolated, and unlikely to be believed if they report abuse. These structural factors create an environment where Mount Massive becomes inevitable, where corporations will torture because torture is profitable, where vulnerable populations will be exploited because exploitation succeeds. The variants are tragic case studies, but the tragedy is reproducible and will be reproduced as long as structural incentives remain. Wayland Park's whistleblowing partially disrupted the system by exposing Mount Massive's activities, but exposure doesn't eliminate structural incentives. Murkoff Corporation faces consequences in the game's universe: lawsuits, investigations, public scandal, but corporations are designed to survive individual scandals. They restructure, rebrand, move operations to different jurisdictions, and continue pursuing profitable activities with slightly modified methodology. Unless structural incentives change, unless military contracts stop rewarding human experimentation, unless healthcare becomes genuinely nonprofit, unless vulnerable populations receive robust protection, the new Mount Massives will emerge under different names in different locations. The game's ending suggests this continuation. Miles's body hosting the Wall Rider escapes into the world, a weapon released from containment. Murkoff's security team tries to stop him and fails catastrophically. The Wall Rider is free, controlled by consciousness that's either Miles's, Billy's, some fusion of both, or entirely autonomous nano-machine intelligence using human host as anchor. This escape represents both liberation and proliferation. The weapon Murkoff created has left their control, carrying methodology with it, potentially available to whoever can capture and study it. This ambiguous ending refuses clean resolution. There's no moment where Murkoff executives face justice, where variants receive posthumous vindication, where systems that enabled Mount Massive are reformed. Instead, horror spreads. The Wall Rider escapes, carrying its trauma-based creation methodology into wider world, and players are left with knowledge that institutional evil succeeded in creating exactly what it set out to create, even if that creation escaped their control. The variants died or stayed broken. The whistleblower survived with permanent trauma. The journalist became the thing he investigated, and the corporation's research continues despite facilities' destruction. The psychiatric diagnoses we've cataloged throughout this examination aren't separate from this systemic analysis. They're integral to it. Understanding Chris Walker's PTSD, Eddie Gluskin's complex trauma, Father Martin's delusional disorder, Billy Hope's catatonia, and the twins' shared psychosis matters because it demonstrates how specific psychiatric vulnerabilities were identified and exploited. Murkoff didn't need every patient to have same diagnosis. They needed variety of presentations that could be amplified differently, tested for different capabilities, weaponized for different applications. Chris Walker's military background made him useful for testing whether combat trauma could be amplified into controllable aggression. Eddie Gluskin's abuse history made him useful for studying how sexual trauma manifests in violence. Father Martin's religiosity made him useful for exploring how delusions organize behavior in leadership roles. Billy Hope's neurological compatibility with the engine made him useful as host. Each patient was selected or retained because their specific pathology offered research value. Their humanity was secondary to their utility. Their suffering was instrumental rather than accidental, and their deaths or destruction were anticipated outcomes rather than failures. This utilitarian calculus, treating humans as means rather than ends, maximizing research value extracted from vulnerable subjects, accepting catastrophic harm as necessary cost, characterizes the institutional pathology that created Mount Massive. The facility didn't fail to provide care. It deliberately withheld care to study deterioration. The engine didn't accidentally harm patients. It was designed to harm them in specific, measurable ways. The variants didn't randomly become violent. They were systematically traumatized until violence became probable outcome. Every horror at Mount Massive traces back to decisions made by people who valued knowledge and profit over human welfare. The game forces players to witness consequences of those decisions through Miles's camera, through documents found in blood-stained offices, through encounters with variants whose humanity persists beneath their pathology. This witnessing is itself a diagnostic tool. Players must assess threats, interpret behaviors, recognize patterns in variants' actions. The gameplay teaches psychiatric observation even as it creates fear, making players identify symptoms while running from the people exhibiting them. This creates uncomfortable parallel to how psychiatric patients are often viewed as cases to be studied, presentations to be categorized, collections of symptoms rather than whole persons. But Outlast also humanizes its variants through details that break clinical distance. Father Martin's genuine care for Miles despite his delusion, Eddie Gluskin's trauma-born confusion about intimacy, Chris Walker's persistent belief he's completing a legitimate mission, the twins' mutual dependence that provided meaning in Nightmare. These moments don't excuse violence but explain it, don't absolve harm but contextualize it, don't make variants safe but make them recognizably human. The game asks players to hold two truths simultaneously. These people are dangerous and must be escaped, and these people are victims who deserved better. This dual consciousness, fear and empathy, self-preservation, and recognition of shared humanity defines Outlast's emotional landscape. It's deeply uncomfortable to fear someone while understanding their victim, to prioritize your survival while recognizing theirs already failed, to escape from people who never had escape as option. The game doesn't resolve this discomfort, but sustains it, refusing to let players view variants as simple monsters or simple victims, but insisting they're both. The psychiatric accuracy serves this dual consciousness by making variants recognizably ill rather than inexplicably evil. When Chris Walker exhibits PTSD symptoms, players who understand PTSD recognize a trauma survivor rather than random killer. When Eddie Gluskin dissociates while torturing victims, players who understand dissociation see someone whose mind fled from unbearable reality. When Father Martin speaks with delusional conviction, players who understand psychosis see someone experiencing false reality as absolute truth. The diagnoses don't make variants less frightening, but they make them frightening for different reasons. Not because mental illness is inherently scary, but because suffering was weaponized into danger. This reframe is crucial. The horror isn't mental illness itself, but what was done to mentally ill people. The fear isn't about psychiatric conditions, but about institutions that exploit them. The tragedy isn't that variants had disorders, but that their disorders were deliberately worsened until they became unmanageable. This shifts responsibility from individuals to systems, from pathology to those who weaponize pathology, from patients to the corporation that turned patients into experiments. The documents scattered throughout Mount Massive reinforced this shift repeatedly, providing institutional critique through bureaucratic language. Patient files show progression from manageable symptoms to severe pathology corresponding with engine exposure. Security reports track violence escalating after experimental procedures. Financial records reveal Murkoff's profit calculations where human suffering is literally quantified as acceptable cost. The paper trail demonstrates that Mount Massive's horror was planned, approved, funded, and sustained by people who knew exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. Reading these documents creates different horror than encountering variance, the horror of recognizing that ordinary bureaucratic processes can produce extraordinary evil, that paperwork and protocols can facilitate torture, that following procedures can mean destroying people. The banality of evil that Hannah Arendt identified in Nazi bureaucrats appears in Mount Massive's administrative documents, where torture is discussed in neutral language, where patients are referred to by numbers, where suffering is data point rather than moral crisis. This institutional horror contextualizes individual horror, explaining how people like Traeger ended up in positions where they could torture with impunity, how patients like Billy Hope could be tortured for months without intervention, how facility could operate for years without external oversight. The horror isn't just what happened, but how systems were structured to make it happen, how multiple levels of bureaucracy approved and sustained atrocity, how everyone involved found ways to rationalize participation or look away. Outlast's psychiatric horror ultimately condemns not minds but systems, not patients but institutions, not illness but exploitation of illness. The variants are frightening, but Murkoff Corporation is monstrous. The variants kill individuals. Murkoff's methodology promises to produce more variants, more suffering, more weaponized madness. The variants are contained within Mount Massive until they die. Murkoff's influence extends into government contracts, military applications, and corporate structures that transcend any single facility. The game's refusal to end with simple villain defeat reinforces this systemic focus. You don't fight Murkoff's CEO as final boss. Don't have moment of cathartic justice where corporation collapses. Instead, Miles escapes or doesn't. Wayland escapes, but changed. The Wall Rider escapes, destination unknown. And Murkoff continues, restructured but functional. This open ending acknowledges that systemic evil doesn't resolve through individual action, that exposing one atrocity doesn't eliminate conditions that produced it, that whistleblowing and investigation and public scandal can create consequences without creating fundamental change. The psychiatric diagnoses documented throughout this script matter because they demonstrate that the variants weren't monsters before Mount Massive made them monstrous, weren't dangerous before danger was induced, weren't beyond help before help was deliberately withheld. Each diagnosis represents missed opportunity for intervention, proof that alternative outcomes were possible, evidence that tragedy was manufactured rather than inevitable. Chris Walker should be alive, receiving trauma treatment at VA facility, reintegrating into civilian life with support and medication and therapy. Eddie Gluskin should be alive, working through his complex trauma with specialized therapists, learning that relationships don't require violence. Father Martin should be alive, taking antipsychotics that reduce his delusions, finding meaning in actual community rather than false religion. Billy Hope should be alive, whatever his original diagnosis, receiving care instead of serving as experimental platform. The twins should be alive and separate, treated for their individual psychoses, developing identities not built on shared delusion. Every variant represents life that could have been saved, person who could have been helped, trajectory that could have been changed. Their deaths aren't tragic accidents, but predictable consequences of deliberately harmful system. Mount Massive didn't fail these people. It succeeded in exploiting them. The facility achieved its goals of research advancement and weapon development. The variant's destruction was metric of that success rather than evidence of failure. This is why diagnosing every mental disorder in Outlast matters beyond academic exercise. Each diagnosis is a reminder that behind horror, game mechanics are representations of actual conditions affecting millions of people, conditions that require care rather than exploitation, compassion rather than weaponization. The game uses mental illness to create effective horror, but underneath gameplay are real psychiatric presentations that deserve recognition and respect rather than stigmatization. The challenge is holding this awareness while experiencing horror game designed to make you fear its mentally ill characters. It's difficult to remember that PTSD doesn't typically make people murderous. While Chris Walker is trying to tear your head off, it's hard to maintain empathy for abuse survivors, while Eddie Gluskin is strapping you to surgical table. It's nearly impossible to think about proper treatment for delusional disorder while Father Martin's cult members are hunting you through burning chapel. This difficulty is precisely why examining Outlast's psychiatric content matters. The game creates immediate fear response that can override contextual understanding, making it crucial to consciously analyze what we're actually afraid of and why. When we identify specific diagnoses, understand their real presentations versus game exaggerations, and recognize how institutional abuse amplified them into danger, we can experience horror while maintaining critical perspective that prevents stigma internalization. The variants deserved better than they received. The patients at Mount Massive deserved treatment instead of torture, care instead of exploitation, dignity instead of dehumanization. They deserved psychiatry that served healing rather than profit, institutions designed to protect rather than harm, systems that recognized their humanity rather than calculated their utility. They deserved what every psychiatric patient deserves: evidence-based treatment, informed consent, respect for autonomy, an unwavering commitment to their well-being over any other consideration. They received opposite of what they deserved, and Outlast horror emerges from that betrayal, the betrayal of medicine's promise to first do no harm, of asylum's original purpose as sanctuary, of society's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members. The game holds up that betrayal for examination, forces players to witness its consequences, and refuses to let anyone, players, characters, or institutions avoid responsibility for what happens when psychiatric treatment becomes psychiatric warfare. Every mental disorder explained in Outlast is ultimately a story about what happens when illness meets institutional evil, when vulnerability encounters exploitation, when people needing help are given harm instead. The diagnoses are specific, the presentations are detailed, the psychiatric content is researched and relatively accurate, but the context transforms clinical presentation into horror. These conditions weren't just present, they were deliberately induced, systematically worsened, and weaponized by people who knew exactly what they were doing.